Cabe decir que para mí es un gusto enorme presentarles al Dr. Simon Marginson del Center for Global Higher Education de la University College of London. Simon, muy bienvenido de nuevo a nuestra casa aquí en la Universidad Nacional. El Dr. Marginson es sin duda uno de los líderes académicos más importantes en el tema de la educación superior hoy en día a nivel mundial. Simon ha consigo ideas, teorías, hipótesis importantísimas para el análisis de la universidad y de la educación superior. Y todo esto está publicado en una enorme cantidad de artículos y libros. Algunos de ellos fueron publicados aquí en México. Este que se llama Hegemonía en la Era del Conocimiento, que es un libro del Seminario de Educación Superior, con la autoría del doctor Imanol Ordorica, que el día de hoy nos hará favor de presentar un perfil académico del doctor Marginson. Perdón, Iman, antes de eso quisiera decir que estamos conectados. El Seminario de Educación Superior tiene conexión con 14 universidades del país y normalmente nos conectamos vía teleconferencia por la computadora y demás. Y hoy estamos conectados con la Universidad Autónoma de Puebla, con la Escuela Nacional de Estudios Superiores de la UNAM en León, con la con la Unión de Universidades de América Latina, que se conecta a su vez con una enorme cantidad de universidades en América Latina, y con la Universidad Autónoma de Morelos. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. Esto para que Simon vea que vamos a tener un público bastante más grande y que va a estar escuchando en otro lado. Todavía no sé cómo vamos a interactuar con ellos, pero por lo pronto, adelante.
Pues buenas tardes, qué bueno que están aquí de forma presencial o en videoconferencia. La verdad es un enorme gusto tener a Simon Marginson y es un lujo muy grande. No es la primera vez que está en México, afortunadamente. Creo que sí es la primera vez que está en esta, que es doblemente mi casa, nuestra casa y la suya, que es el Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas, a quienes agradecemos tanto a la directora como al personal de apoyo del instituto que siempre nos permite realizar actividades aquí, y a los colegas académicos. Entonces, bienvenido, Simon, a esta casa que también es tuya, como integrante del Seminario de Educación Superior de la UNAM, del que formas parte desde hace pues casi 15 años, hace mucho tiempo, ¿no? Tuve la fortuna de conocer al doctor Marginson en una conferencia internacional en 1998, en un contexto bastante extraño. Esta se desarrollaba en un hotel que era al mismo tiempo la sede de la asociación, del Congreso de la Asociación para el Estudio de la Educación Superior, y el cuartel general de Jeb Bush, cuando ganó la gubernatura del estado de Florida. Entonces era creo que el doctor Hugo Casanova estaba por ahí también, y Manuel Gil. Era una convivencia un poco extraña de académicos y de pues que en una buena parte tenían o seguimos teniendo posiciones críticas, con un conglomerado de políticos norteamericanos de derecha que hoy deben estar de plácemes en la misma medida en la que nosotros estamos un poco incómodos o tristes por el devenir de los acontecimientos políticos. Desde ese momento en donde el doctor Marginson aparecía en el escenario de Estados Unidos con un morral grande y un libro que acababa de salir y que él vendía de mano en mano, que se llama Markets in Education, Mercados en la Educación, que ha sido reseñado aquí para la revista Perfiles Educativos hace un buen número de años. Hizo una especie de entrada triunfal en el escenario mundial de la educación superior. En un campo que es el de la educación superior, que es de relativamente reciente creación, con prácticamente solamente una generación por encima de nosotros ya veteranos, que fue conformada por ilustres académicos como Burton Clark o Gainir, otros de esa camada de profesionales estudiosos de la educación superior que han ido pues desapareciendo incluso por causas demográficas del escenario. Emergió una nueva generación con figuras de una talla muy importante como Sheila Slaughter y Simon Marginson. Y creo que hoy en día, en este momento, podríamos decir sin ningún temor a equivocarnos que la figura más influyente en el campo de estudios de la educación superior a nivel mundial está sentado aquí con nosotros en este auditorio, y es Simon Marginson. Que además de ser tan importante académicamente, tiene buen sentido del humor. Simon empezó sus actividades universitarias como parte de la dirección estudiantil de la Unión Australiana de Estudiantes. Para mí esto es muy importante porque es algo que nos ha hermanado en una forma de pensar el tema de la educación superior. Después estuvo mucho tiempo involucrado con los sindicatos de profesores universitarios de secundaria primero y luego universitarios en Australia, para después dedicarse de lleno a las tareas propiamente académicas con el cumplimiento de su doctorado. Ha sido profesor en primer lugar de la Universidad de Monash en Australia, después de la Universidad de Melbourne y ahora de la Universidad de Londres, en su Instituto de Estudios de la Educación, en donde tiene el centro más importante y con más financiamiento de todo el mundo. Esto es un peligro decirlo aquí porque todos queremos tap in al financiamiento, pero que tiene su sede en esta universidad y de la cual él es el presidente o el director del Centro de Estudios de la Educación Superior y la Globalización en la Universidad de Londres. Ha sido profesor visitante en la Universidad de Hiroshima, en Japón, en la Universidad de Moscú, y ha tenido el honor, por ejemplo, de impartir las Clark Kerr Lectures, las conferencias en reconocimiento y homenaje a Clark Kerr, quien fuera presidente de la Universidad de California en los años 60, en medio de los conflictos estudiantiles y en una abierta confrontación con el entonces gobernador Ronald Reagan, y que fue el diseñador de algo que es conocido como el Plan Maestro de la Educación Superior en California, que se convirtió como en una especie de guía de cómo desarrollar la educación superior en muchos países. Entonces a Simon le tocó, fue nominado para hacer la presentación de estas conferencias hace apenas 2 años. La verdad es que sería larguísimo tratar de resumir su amplio currículum, sus publicaciones, sus participaciones. Es editor de la revista más importante académica de educación superior en este momento, la revista Higher Education, que coedita con otro colega nuestro del seminario, Yussi Lima, de la Universidad de Yeváscula. Ha sido editor o dictaminador o miembro del consejo editorial del Journal of Higher Education, del Review of Higher Education, del Australian Journal of Education, o sea, cantidad de publicaciones. El trabajo de Simon es un trabajo que se funda en la sociología política y en la economía política, pero también con un fuerte énfasis en historia, en teoría de la cultura, y que fundamentalmente a partir de trabajo cualitativo de un muy amplio rango que va desde entrevistas hasta análisis documentales e históricos, ha ido construyendo una visión de la educación superior en un contexto de globalización que ya dura un buen tiempo y que hoy ha entrado en una nueva fase. Tiene más de 300 artículos académicos en revistas con arbitraje, más de 15 libros. Probablemente uno podría recomendar el sueño ha terminado, que es un libro en donde se publican las conferencias alrededor de Clark Kerr y el impacto de ese modelo en el contexto de la globalización. Nada más para terminar, no alargar más esto, ha sido asesor en temas educativos de la OCDE, de la Universidad de Pekín, de diversas universidades en el mundo, ha hecho estudios para la Unión Europea, para el Centro de Estudios de Educación Superior, CHEPS, en Holanda, ha estado como visitante en la Universidad de Virginia, es asesor muy crítico, por cierto, de rankings como el Times Higher Education y del ranking de Shanghái. Las críticas que ha hecho a los rankings lo han hecho merecedor, digo yo, de demandas judiciales por parte de rankings como el PUEES, a los que ha criticado de ser una ciencia social pobre, ¿no? Y por cuyos comentarios estuvo en vísperas de ser llevado a la corte, ¿no? Así que el rango de sus actividades se ubican en el terreno de la reflexión académica, del análisis de las políticas públicas y del desarrollo de políticas públicas alternativas, el comentario permanente de los temas de la educación superior, que ejerce también como un editorialista en medios de comunicación masivos. Lo hizo en Australia y lo ha seguido haciendo en Inglaterra y con impacto en otros países. Entonces, creo que sin dar más vueltas al asunto, resumiría, estamos ante un personaje de la Academia Mundial, sus citas en muy distintos indicadores como el Google Scholar o el Scopus o la que quieran ustedes ver, ratifica esto de manera contundente, por si hiciera falta datos concretos, pero creo que su producción académica es la que mejor establece la valía del ponente que hoy tenemos la suerte de escuchar. Y como un breve comercial, el libro que hicimos juntos, que está a la venta aquí afuera, si lo compran además se los firmamos. Entonces, aprovechenlo. Los dejo entonces con mi querido amigo y colega Simon Marginson.
Muchas gracias, Simon. That was a very generous introduction. And let me immediately say how happy I am to be here between Dr. Munoz and Dr. Odorica, two scholars who I admire and like very much. And being here at UNAM is always a wonderful experience because of the greatness of the vision and the accomplishment of the university. The great public university in the Latin American model is quite different in its laws of motion, social laws, to the Anglo-American Science University of the rankings. But as a social model of higher education, it's at least equally well developed and valid. In many respects superior because it serves society in a much more fully engaged manner, with a more developed political philosophy of its role in relation to the state, and a more inclusive social agenda. So, including economic, political and cultural agenda. So you have a situation where UNAM plays a role in Mexico that, you know, Harvard does not play in the United States. UNAM is more important in its nation than Harvard is in its nation. And this is quite a different model in many ways, not as selective, more inclusive, encouraging a plurality of activity and engagement, production and creativity across a huge range of areas. And I think it's very important that this model continues in this period and survives the pressure that's on it to become something more like a global template. I always learn a lot by coming here, and I'm very glad to see you all and to share this seminar with you. Imanol's generous introduction made me think about how in higher education we're very good at building status, and we're good at building status for ourselves. It's one of our habits, and I guess it's if we give status to intellectual life and cultural life and science by doing this, I think that's very good, providing we don't lose contact with the society and don't forget where we came from, you know. And when people ask me, you know, why were you successful in your career, I usually just say, I wrote a lot. And that's true, as Imanol made clear, I think. But I'm only really pleased about, you know, 4 or 5 things that I've done, and one of them is the essay that we did together. What I want to do today is reflect on where we're at in higher education now that we've seen this great political shift in the last 12 months. Because I've got no doubt this is a big change at a world level, and it's going to affect everyone profoundly. It's already affecting us. So what I want to do is review a little the history to put higher education in its larger political, economic and cultural context, to talk about globalization and what's happened with that, and then to get to the rise of the Trump ascendancy in the United States, Brexit and the pressure on the EU, the emergence of Le Pen as a very close contender for the presidency in France, and the way in which this is starting now to directly affect universities, the educational mission, science, academic freedom, and our connections to the people we serve, shown already by the attempt to close the Central European University, which happened in the last 24 hours, something I'm being personally involved in and I'm very concerned about, and also the closure of the European University in St. Petersburg last week by the Russian government, and the extraordinary pressure on teachers and academics in Turkey, with hundreds of people imprisoned and some of them tortured simply because they will not adopt the political philosophy of the regime. So this is beginning, this new struggle is now beginning to affect higher education. But let's go back a little and think about what brought us to this point. I mean, the big turning point was around about 1990, when the Cold War was winding up and the US sent its consultants into Russia and deconstructed the Russian political economy in a matter of 5 years, with enormous waste and suffering that resulted in Eastern Europe after that. But the end of the Cold War was in many ways a very good thing, because it de-emphasized militarization and led to a renewed emphasis on economics and on social development. So the 1990s emerged at the same time also as something completely out of left field, which no one would have predicted, which didn't owe itself to the Cold War. Well, it did, but not ultimately owe itself to the Cold War. And it didn't owe itself to capitalist development particularly, but it did owe itself to science and technology, and that was the emergence of the internet. And the internet changed everything, just like the end of the Cold War changed everything. And what we got out of that was this double-headed process of globalization. And contemporary globalization, of course, not the first. Globalization, you could say, begins with the Neolithic Revolution. You know, that's a global process of spread of agriculture. The world religions, the European trade and conquest exploitation empires of the 16th, 17th century. These are all global processes of one sort or another, but we had our own globalization, was the globalization of the 1990s and after. And it had two aspects to it. One was the neoliberal globalization, the globalization of world markets, of the declining role of the state as the multinationals get bigger and bigger, of the transfer of production around the world, of the cutting back of government spending in many countries, austerity as it became called, the triumph of finance capitalism, with finance capitalism making the rules for the state in many ways. But a great expansion in cross-border trade and foreign direct investment. And along with that, we have communicative globalization, the globalization of the internet, the formation of a worldwide library, in effect through the internet, the movement of academic journals and academic conversation into the global environment, so that it became world conversations, a great spread of science, and in education and in many other sectors, an increase in cross-border mobility of people, as well as ideas and technologies and so on. So, in many respects, very positive. It contained within it also a double-sided aspect. There was the loss of cultural diversity, the suppression of creative work outside the English language in science, for example, the weakening of the humanities and the social sciences, which were not in the same way part of this sort of global academic process, the capacity, of course, of strong economies to flatten weaker economies and to dominate them. But it was different to the high point of imperialism that Lenin and others talked about at the beginning of the 20th century, because it also fostered a process of modernization, economic and social development in many countries, because the banks knew that companies would sell more products to modernized economies in which indigenous people, women and others were brought into the center of society as consumers. And so you had this cultural process of universalization, of a creation of a sense of belonging for everyone through the medium of the sale of world products, and the rollout of the mall as the archetypal social form throughout the world. So you had this process of capitalism driving a world community of a kind, but full of inequality, and a community which, like all capitalist forms, becomes more unequal over time. And so we had the situation where you had greater equality between countries and increasing inequality in most countries at the same time. Greater equality between countries was the progressive development. It didn't come to every country. It came to a significant number of new emerging middle-income countries that became wealthier. And so we saw a country like Korea, one of the very poorest countries in Asia in 1960 after the Korean War. Now it has a per capita GDP of European levels. It's exceptionally dynamic, very good education system, very progressive policy in many spheres, a good place to live in many respects. You're fortunate to be born Korean at this time, and you wouldn't have said that 50 years ago after the war. It was so devastating. But now, Korea is this wonderful country, and And China, of course, is the great example of a country which has come forward in this period, but there's also others. Brazil, in its contradictory way, has come forward substantially through these processes. And you could point also to India, which is making the climb out of a country which has been essentially trapped in a kind of by a huge agricultural economy. And it's this process of people moving from the countryside to the cities, the growth of the middle class, and the reduction in absolute poverty around the world from about 45% of the world population to about 10%. So these were the positive things, but there were many negatives. And I mean, the deconstruction of the social democratic role of the state in many countries was one of those negatives. But things began to change, and they changed first of all with the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. People always forget about the Pentagon part of it in 2001. That was the beginning of a big sea change in the world political environment. We sensed that, we didn't really know what would happen. But it didn't show itself at every level urgently. It showed itself in the gradual reassertion of national polities, the weakening of multilateralism in the world level and international environment. It showed itself in reassertion of American unilateral intervention around the world, this habit, which had been partly broken by the Vietnamese, of being able to intervene in every country freely with troops, with weapons, with bombardment. And that showed itself first of all in the Middle East and Northern Africa, which has become a kind of valley of fire and a permanent crisis and a terrible part of the world, terrible for the people who live there. And that politics began in 2001. But meanwhile, for most of that decade, the previous decade, the processes of neoliberal globalization and the process of communicative globalization continued to roll out. So you had increasing migration. And in fact, even now migration is increasing. Although it's much more contested in some countries than it was, it's still increasing at a world level. And there was a great surge of it in the year between 2000 and 2010. There was a huge surge in migration. Of all kinds, high skill, poorer people, refugees, all forms of migration were increasing in that decade. Then you also had, of course, the continuing rollout of the internet and more plurality on the internet with more languages other than English starting to play a much larger role, so that the English conversation on the internet became less than 25%, whereas in the first 5 years of the internet, it was overwhelmingly dominant. And you also saw a tremendous growth and development of higher education and science. And this is, this is an extraordinary process because it's without precedent in human history. We saw, beginning in the late 90s, we saw the total gross tertiary enrollment ratio, that's 2-year diploma courses and degree programs and above, go from about 15% of the school leaver age group to 35%. So, a doubling from the late 1990s to now. In those 20 years, the proportion of the world's young people who go to tertiary education more than doubled. And this occurred in every world region. Latin America, major growth. In Chile, Venezuela, Colombia, really surged. Argentina was always a big level of participation. Brazil began to catch up. And it was similar in other parts of the world. Huge growth in East Asia, with every country except China now having more than 50% of its young people in tertiary education. 50%. It used to be thought that you could only educate 10 or 15% of people to an advanced level. I mean, that's completely changed. China is at 40% now, and it's still going up. India the growth has come to India as well, and it's surging. Not Pakistan, not Bangladesh,
but India, and in Eastern Europe has caught up to Western Europe. Russia always had a high participation level, and that was common to much of the region, but its participation in higher education grew very remarkably in Eastern Europe and continued to advance everywhere, so that in the United States it reached 90% of the young age group, and in Korea it reached about 95%. And what happens is that countries reach about 50% and they keep growing. Now Mexico was, I think, slow in this process of growth of participation. It's one of the signs that all is not well in the education system, that the growth of tertiary participation has been slow. And I think that one of the generalizations you can make is that it's countries where the main growth is occurring in the public sector, where it seems to be most sustainable and strongest. And so the East Asians have done well because they've just moved into strong public system approach, with the private sector playing a role, but the private sector is so closely regulated in Japan and Korea that it's like the public sector. It's controlled that closely as the public system is, and in terms of standards and the quality of teachers and those sorts of things. And it's where that the for-profit sector was able to play a big role. That's countries which have relied on the for-profit sector to grow. They can achieve some quick growth, but it often falls away again. Completion rates are very low, graduate employment rates are low, and it's not a good vehicle for system expansion in the long term. So the public sector is really quite crucial, and it's been very important in the process of expansion for the state to put more money rather than less money into education. And most countries have been doing this one way or another, not all. But at the same time also, the growth of science really accelerates in the 2000s, and you see the number of countries that are publishing enough science papers for us to say that they've got their own indigenous research system went from 36 to 51, and that Mexico is in that group. But not all of the countries that have high participation systems are yet high science countries, but an increasing number of countries are. When the internet became the medium for world scientific production, you could say that a genuine world science system developed. It was centred on the US, UK, Western Europe, but it's potentially more inclusive, and as science has pluralised, it has become more plural in terms of who contributes to it. And that world science system is where most countries source their technological innovations. Business industry goes not to its own researchers, but to the world science to achieve the new ideas. It needs to develop products and the new technologies. So, but to access world science, every country needs its own scientific capacity. And this has actually meant that in the global knowledge era, national capacity in science has become more important rather than less. And indeed, science as a whole has become more important rather than less. So this is, I think, the kind of positive underlying logic of the world-class university movement. I mean, people think it's about status building, and it is partly about status building, but the underlying logic is the greater role of science and the need for countries to have genuine research universities. And the better measures of scientific performance do tell you whether you have good science or not. The rankings of the Times Higher or the QS type are terrible because they are not about who's got scientific capacity, let alone who teaches well. They're about status, they're about reputation as measured in surveys, they're about a whole set of indicators which allow the rankers to manipulate the tables according to their own business interests. If they're building more business activity in Africa, they have an African ranking, and they promote the countries that they've got their headquarters in, and those countries do well in the ranking. It's very cynical. And they've been trying to do that in Latin America in the same way. This great growth of science, this is positive, I think, and the growth of higher education. But we can ask ourselves, you know, what kind of university has come out of this extraordinary growth of higher education? You know, is it the Humboldt University? Is it the neoliberal university? Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, it's not a simple story. We have been, I think, relentless in our criticism of corporatism, the business model, especially of competition and stratification of the academic profession. We have been right to criticise this. And if we hadn't criticised this consistently, and there hadn't been resistance to some forms of corporate reform, then things would have been worse. But, you know, I don't think it's entirely a negative story in the sense that the academic profession still, in many disciplines, not in all disciplines, I worry about business studies, in many disciplines is still in command of the knowledge system. Whether it will stay like that, I'm not sure. I also think the commitment to social inclusion and equity amongst educators is very strong as a principle. I don't think they have been successful in using the universities to make societies more equal because the other factors at work in society, like taxation system and how that works, whether it's progressive or regressive, the pattern of government spending and who that benefits, whether it benefits upper middle class or it benefits everyone, whether it's ennobling and the building of agency, as Amartya Sen says in his capabilities argument, or it's simply just another way of giving public goods to the upper middle class along with the private goods they already have, you know. Those sorts of things are very important too. Wage determination, the strength of unions in the workplace have a lot to do with how equal a society is. Where unions are weak, capitalism is strong, and the society becomes more unequal over time. And that's of course what happened to the United States after 1980, after Reagan broke the air traffic controllers strike in 1981 and deunionisation set in. So all these other factors have been working, I think, in many countries to make society more unequal rather than more equal. But higher education, I think, has done its best. And where I think we've allowed ourselves to err on the side of inequality, especially, has been stratification of the sector. The way in which a hierarchy, you know, has developed in many countries, not in all countries, so that the strongest universities have got stronger and government has defunded mass education rather than increasingly funded it. The per student level of funding in most countries is down to what it was 20 years ago. You can say partly that's growth, but you know, the fact is that education of quality has not been respected, and there's been an increasing belief that all that matters is that people, you know, participate. Maybe they get a diploma at the end, even if they don't learn very much. That's not so important. And I think we've allowed this drift into poor quality mass education in many countries. I say not all countries because you see, you know, it is possible to have strong systems which are only moderately stratified between the research-intensive universities and the teaching institutions, where the quality of the mass education is quite good, where all of the teachers are qualified, where there's a lot of emphasis on reaching out to underrepresented populations, minorities, indigenous people, and so on. And I can think, for example, of the Nordic countries, which place education on great priority and regard it as the central element in maintaining social equality and the rights of citizens. The Dutch do quite well at this. The Germans, I think, are doing better over time, and not now a good example. And the Koreans do it well, and they're more competitive. It's a more relentless system, I think, a bit tough on the kids. But they do provide a high quality to everyone, and the same is happening in the other East Asian countries. China is doing its best on this problem as well. It's hypnotised by the world-class university process, but they're trying to work on their second and third tier by boosting vocational education. Now, China has got a tendency to great social inequality. That's its history and tradition. So whether inequality will win or equality will win in China is an open question. But China may go the way of the United States and become more unequal over time, but it may not. But you know, this has been a good story. But then I think that things changed in 2008 in the recession, and in the Atlantic countries and Western Europe. And I think that, you know, it wasn't everywhere, the recession of 2008. I mean, it didn't. I was in Australia. It didn't affect us. We were trading heavily in East Asia. That we were dependent economically on the region we were in, and we didn't have any negative growth period at all. Unemployment didn't go up. There was a kind of rocky period in the finance sector because the whole finance sector was worldwide was destabilised, and it's all interconnected. And there was a stimulus budget to get through that 2 years or so. But we weren't disadvantaged by the 2008 period, not very much. China was fine, it was steamed ahead. Whole of East Asia was okay, India was okay. Didn't change things much in Africa. In Latin America, it didn't have the same effects that it had in North America and Europe. But the change in the politics in those regions, in North America and Europe, was great. And they're still very important worldwide, you know, in terms of shaping the environment, not only economically and politically, but culturally as well. And in 2008, a number of things happened. And one was that inequality in those countries got a lot worse, because coming out of the recession and the solutions that were offered to the recession, the position of the top 1%, the top 0.1% and so on, was protected. And it was the poorer families that suffered. So that, you know, that the Afro-American families that had bought into high mortgage housing in large numbers and saw the value of their housing collapse to a third or a quarter of the price, to the point where they're unable to repay their mortgages, and they're unable to sell their houses. And this, that predatory lending on a great scale really came home to roost at that point. At the same time, minimum wage stayed down and other wages were falling. And in the United States, there's been scarcely any improvement in the position of the bottom 50% over the last 3 decades. And the bottom 20% have lost ground. The recession really saw a sharp shift, further shift in that income distribution. That has played itself out, I think, in the politics of the post-2008 period quite profoundly. And state governments in the US no longer had enough money for public education. Community colleges started to be impoverished. The US at the same time brought in this new process of subsidising for-profits on a great scale because of their capacity to control the Congress on both sides through their capacity to pay high-value lobbyists and get their way with the Congress, and to buy politicians through donation to election campaigns. And so the for-profit sector boomed while the public sector was being impoverished. And so you saw this big shift towards education as a private good, which had been happening for some time. At the same time, the faltering, and this is very interesting, faltering of globalisation, economic globalisation at the world level. I saw some very interesting stats in The Economist on this about 6 months ago. Since 2008, the proportion of exports which is engaged in cross-border supply chains, multi-country production, proportion of exports that involves multi-country production has plateaued. There's been no growth since 2007. So that trend of increase in cross-border production stopped at 2007 and 8, just levelled off and has dipped slightly now. If foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP has fallen since about the same time and has stayed down. Multinationals are no longer, in terms of profitability, no longer stand out. The national companies in many countries have caught up technologically with the multinationals. The advantages that multinationals gained have been largely eroded in terms of technical production. The exception is the high-tech industries. We all know them, the household names, our favourite brands. They're still doing pretty well. They're the multinationals that are still flourishing. But the other multinationals are not, including finance. So you've seen this really significant shift away from the trend to increasing globalisation of the world economy. That's one of the things that lies behind what's clearly emerged in the Atlantic countries are a sort of anti-free trade grouping within the wealthy, within the company owners, the executives, the managers at the peak of capitalist society. That it's no longer assumed that free trade is the way forward, that there's a split around free trade versus a national protectionist approach. So it isn't just something that Donald Trump dreamed up for the masses. I mean, it is, there are significant numbers of his backers who've made the decision that it's in their interest economically to take a more hardline protectionist approach, to break up multilateral trade deals, to go for a kind of war, economic war, and so on. So significant shift in globalisation in the economy. I don't think we've seen the same shift in away from globalisation of culture. Communicative globalisation continues. We're all engaged with each other. In higher education, there's been not a sign yet of any reduction in the rate of internationalisation, the amount of cross-border movement, the amount of research cooperation across borders, and so on. But the pressure will come on migration, where although migration is still increasing, I think the resistance to migration and political changes that are occurring now are going to halt that process of growth. In some countries anyway, migration will fall. We've also seen the further reduction in the multilateral organisations. The EU has now come under unprecedented pressure, and refugee migration pressure has been the decisive factor there. So big shift toward in economic globalisation, so it's declining. Migration, people movement is now in question. Trump's wall is of course a symbol of that, of the desire of national polities to halt migration flows. And this will impact higher education. And then of course, we had 2016. So with all these tendencies to modify globalisation, especially economic globalisation going on, no one was quite prepared for the sudden political shift that occurred in 2016. So we have a new kind of conservatism, very sophisticated, very technologically capable, very good at manipulating the electorate, treating it like a kind of a reality show. Send your text in if you want your country back. Text on this number if you want to give your country away. Text in if you want America to be great again. Text on the other number if you want America to get smaller. It's pretty straightforward, isn't it? It's pretty easy to manipulate people if identity becomes the linchpin of politics. So what is it that characterises the sort of ideological content of the alt-right? Well, I think the important point is that identity rather than class is central. And in this we can see the seeds of some of this in the globalisation of the 1990s. I mean, neoliberal globalisation was very bad for class, very bad for class politics. It put class politics on the back foot at national level. It put social democrats, who'd always been internationalists, into the situation of having to defend workers' rights and the needs of populations from a national vantage point against globalisation. That was a very bad position to be trapped in, because globalisation had all the cards to play at that point of time. It could surround the nation in effect, and you couldn't mobilise the nation strongly enough to resist it. And I think, but on the other hand, so while class politics was on the back foot, identity politics was favoured by cultural globalisation, because it was inclusive. The world market sells to everyone, whatever the colour of their skin, whatever their gender, whatever their age. You're all included in the human community now because we want you to buy our products. Even advertising starts to take on a different style. And identity politics flourished. We were able to be oppositional and critical so much more easily around gender, sexuality, indigenous identity than over class. It was hard to. We were always trying to pull those issues together as far as we could, but it was, it tended to be the momentum, especially in the United States, but really everywhere to some extent, was with identity politics that was about sections and parts of the community and not the whole community, and not rethinking the whole social relation and the whole political economy, but advancing the position competitively, in effect, of some groups within the overall environment. There was solidarity across those identities. That was really important, but maybe there wasn't quite enough. And it was easy, I guess, for the alt-right to sort of twist that and play that card as well, and say, okay, we don't like all those identities. What we like is, maleness, whiteness, and so on, and nationality. So the alt-righters, the Democrats call it in the United States call it white nationalism, because in the United States it's particularly about racism. It's particularly anti-Hispanic, anti-Afro-American, but it's also anti-Muslim, and that the Muslim card has been the other, which isn't inside the country, as well as being the card to play to then secure the repression of those who are inside the country. So identity politics has temporarily at least hijacked class in the alt-right, and the other thing the alt-right does is political polarisation. It divides the electorate. It deliberately sets out to create a very sharp distinction between two camps, two parts of the reality show. Isn't it interesting how education and science are positioned on the other side, and have become terms of abuse in some parts of the alt-right and some of its propaganda. So scapegoating, creating enemies, creating conflict, threatening war. I mean, Trump has threatened war against a range of countries since his campaign started, and threatening war by other means like trade wars and so on, migration wars, all kinds of conflictual politics. And it's also explicitly anti-globalisation. So it's using the people's concerns and resistances to globalisation, or some aspects of it, as a key fault line in politics, so that it divides the electorate between those who are sort of pro-globalisation and those who are anti-globalisation, and positions itself with those who are anti. I mean, this is why I think we're in a really different political situation, because, no one in the mainstream of politics criticised the main tenets of economic globalisation till quite recently. But you've now got a situation where, for example, in the Brexit process in the UK, the Tory government, its Conservative government, has basically adopted the Brexit view and is implementing it, because it didn't give any thought to another referendum or trying to overturn the decision. It decided to retain power. We have to go with this. So we need to become like UKIP. We need to become more nationalist, more UK-centric, anti-EU, and so on. And in particular, anti-migration from the EU, which was the issue on which the Brexit vote actually turned. So you have a situation where the UK's strongest industry, its big world star, is the City of London, the finance sector, which has given the British more power than they perhaps would otherwise have had, given that they're a middle-sized country. But the finance has been, the industry of the 1990s. The global industry is the one where the British excelled, and that London put itself in a stronger position than any of New York or any other American financial centre, for example, in terms of the transactions it handles and the amount of money it makes out of the world through its financial operations. So it's been a big success for the UK and central to the economy. Everything else has been sacrificed to it. That's what austerity policies have been about in the UK, stripping the public sector out to prop up the finance sector. And now, the rules are these. If you want to, the only way you could retain from the UK, the only way the UK can retain access to the single market in Europe, the single market trading environment, the free trading environment in Europe, would be to accept freedom of people movement, continued European migration freely across the border. And the UK has just said, no, we won't do that. That's our starting point. That's our bottom line. We will not accept free movement anymore. We're getting out of that. And that inexorably means the City of London crashes as the world financial centre. Because the City of London's role depends on the fact that it can attract international banks and international companies into London They locate there and then get single passport access to Europe. It provides a certificate of access to European business in every EU country. Without that, you've got to negotiate separate arrangements with every country. Now, if international business can't do that in the UK, it has to go to Paris or Frankfurt. And that is what's going to happen. It's beginning to happen now. But Theresa May and the British Conservatives are prepared to give away their global jewel, their free trade jewel, and the finance sector where they've benefited so much from free trade because they want to retain control of their border. Wow, you know, and they're going to be impoverished by that. It's a huge shift, and that's the kind of thing Trump is doing as well, you know, making those kinds of decisions. So that neoliberal globalisation, you know, we're in the post-neoliberal era. I mean, we're not there in terms of our culture and our ideas yet, but whether the post-neoliberal era is the one we wanted to be in is another question. And so that's the challenge for us. I think that I'm probably taking this a bit too long, Emmanuel, but let me just say that I guess how important it is to recognise that higher education is central. It's a central player now in these problems and these issues. And you can see that by looking at what happened in the Brexit vote in the UK in June last year and in the Trump vote in the presidency, in the US presidency in November. Now, the best overall predictors of how people voted were not their class position or their wealth, not whether you're rich or poor. I mean, support for Trump and Brexit cut across class lines and in different ways. I mean, in the UK, the average Brexit supporter was poorer than those who wanted to stay in the EU, whereas in the US, those who voted for Trump were a little bit better off than those who voted for Clinton, partly because of the racial composition of the Trump vote, which was so white. And so it wasn't class, and the class messages were flowing in both directions. The clearest indicators of why people voted for Brexit or for Trump were whether they lived in large cities, in which case they didn't. They stayed in the EU and they voted for Clinton, or they lived in small towns in the countryside, in which if they did, they voted for Trump and they voted for Brexit. So it was location, cities versus country, globally connected city versus especially, because in the big global cities the votes were overwhelmingly against Brexit and Trump. So cities versus rurality, locality, and the other one was education. If you hold a degree in the UK, you almost certainly voted to stay in the European Union. If you left school early, you almost certainly voted to leave the EU. In the case of the US election, Nate Silver did a very good analysis where he looked at the different counties. He broke the vote down to county level, which is what they do in electoral analysis in the US. And he looked at the counties with the 50 counties which were with the highest level of degree holding, and the 50 counties with the lowest level of degree holding. So the most educated counties and the least educated counties. Now, in the counties which were the least educated, Clinton lost ground in 47 of those of the 50 compared to Obama's vote in the previous election, 2012. And she lost ground by about 11 percentage points on average. In the counties with the highest level of education, Clinton improved on Obama's 2012 vote in 48 out of 50 by an average of 9 percentage points. And what's interesting is that these trends, these cut right across the racial composition of the vote, so that you had, in the highly educated areas, the white voters voting for Clinton. The only group of white voters overall in the country who voted for Clinton were college-educated women. So it looks like the education factor was sort of larger, or as large as the racial factor, which was so important. And in the UK, the education factor was overwhelmingly the largest single indicator of how people would vote. Now, this association between higher education and people's resistance to mobility or their ease with mobility, resistance to global connectedness or ease with global connectedness makes sense. I mean, it's instrumental. It's not a coincidence. I mean, recently the OECD published its perspectives on global development 2017 international migration. And so this is about migration and where we're at with migration, basically, politics and political economy and social aspects of migration. And it had a table in it which compared the cross-border mobility of people with and without university degrees. Now, amongst people who don't have a degree, whether you move across borders really depends on how much money you've got. There's a close correlation between your level of income and whether you're mobile. That makes sense, doesn't it? You've got more money, you can travel. That's pretty straightforward. Except it's not that straightforward, actually. Because when people have degrees, it changes. If they have a degree, they're much more likely to be mobile than if they don't. And if they have a degree at a relatively low level of income, they're still quite likely to be mobile compared to other people. And this is the most interesting thing. You go from low income degree holder to high income degree holder, and there's not much change in the rate at which people travel. In other words, something happens to people with higher education. They get more agency. They're more able to move. They're more able to work the systems. They're more able to find a way to be mobile. And, you know, which is not an easy thing to do. It's not easy to cross borders on a long-term basis. And having done it myself, I assure you it's not easy. But, you know, so there's something there very important about the positive potential of higher education to deal with the alt-right, to deal with this kind of cultural division that it's created, to deal with this resurgence of misogynist, of racist, national particularist. I like the expression of the Italian Prime Minister, closed nationalism. You know, the idea that you just look after your own country and it doesn't matter what happens to anyone else. But education changes people and it makes them more cosmopolitan, makes them more confident in dealing with each other. It gives them the capacity to deal with a complicated, conflicted, and insecure world. And so, if the rate of participation in genuine education, and not fake education, but genuine education advances, then we can expect the political base of this kind of right wing will shrink. But that's if we get that far, and that's if education doesn't become a casualty of this period. And I think that is the point at which I'd like to finish up. We're in real danger that universities, science, higher education are going to be targeted as liberal institutions that need to be dismantled. And you can already see the signs of that happening with the early warnings that Trump came out with against Berkeley and others over free speech. But the closure of the Central European University, which was coordinated with the closure of the European University in St. Petersburg a week before, really speaks volumes. It appears that the strongmen leaders in Turkey, Russia, Hungary, and we think they're colluding with Trump, are talking to each other about how to shut down these liberal institutions which are internationalist, which have a lot of cross-border traffic coming through, which are open critics of the regime, which are advocates of democratic rights because they're advocates of academic freedom and the free and development of all students. It follows from their mission that they're pitched against this kind of closed nationalism, and politics of division and fear, on which these regimes are resting. And the fact that these regimes are colluding, or appear to be colluding, is a very dangerous sign, because it means that cross-border mobility of individual researchers and teachers is likely to be affected when regimes colluding with each other. You're likely also to see more attempts to close foreign universities because they're easy targets. I would think that all the schemes that favour cooperation across borders, and so they're all going to come under pressure. I think the challenge for us is very great, because we need to strengthen in the countries especially where it's in question, we need to strengthen social solidarity as part of our role. We need to do that for local communities. We need to do that within the nation. And at the same time, we need to maintain our international perspective and role. And when the politics at the time is to split those two things apart and oppose them to each other, we've somehow got to rebuild the bridge between what you might call class solidarity, social democratic perspective in the nation, and international solidarity, intercultural solidarity, intercultural respect at the world level, what you might call a global social democracy. I mean, I think that, you know, not since the internationals of the pre-Second World War period, the social democratic movement has not been sufficiently strong in its internationalism, although there's some great examples where international solidarity has made a big difference to particular national situations. But it's something we need to recover. Perhaps by evacuating global internationalism, the mainstream of the right is giving space again for the left to move into that space. But the urgent question is to build solidarity at home, it seems to me, in these fractured societies that we're now seeing. What we face, I guess, is a rogue US administration, which is going to destabilise this region and cause considerable angst to its own people as well. We face a situation where rectors and other higher education leaders are going to be thrust into a much sharper political environment. It's going to be a difficult time, and a time in which I think we'll be called on to be unprecedentedly creative in the kinds of strategies that we use to reach out and contribute to our societies. Thanks. Thanks.